The morning of January 5, 1943, Lieutenant Toka Kakizaki banks his Aichi D, a dive bomber, hard over Guadalcanal, pulling away from his bombing run on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. His aircraft is damaged but airworthy. The mission is complete. Time to head home. Below him, the American cruiser Helena opens fire with her 5-inch guns, 3 salvos. 6 shells scream into the sky. Kakizaki never sees them coming. The shells don't need to hit him directly. They detonate in midair, 70 feet from his aircraft, creating a lethal sphere of shrapnel that shreds his dive bomber in seconds. The wreckage tumbles into the Pacific. What Lieutenant Kakizaki could not have known, what nobody in the Japanese Imperial Navy understood in January of 1943, was that he had just been killed by a weapon German scientists had declared technologically impossible. A weapon so secret it was classified at the same security level as the atomic bomb. A weapon containing a miniature radio transmitter that survived 20,000 G-forces and detonated automatically when it sensed an enemy aircraft nearby. This is the story of the proximity fuse. How American engineers built vacuum tubes that could withstand forces that shattered glass. How that technology remained hidden for 3 years. And how, when Luftwaffe pilots finally encountered it over Europe, they faced a nightmare their best scientists insisted could never exist. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem begins long before Pearl Harbor. Anti-aircraft gunnery in the 1930s is an exercise in educated guessing. Gunners see an enemy aircraft approaching at altitude. They estimate its speed, calculate its trajectory, manually set a timed fuse, load the shell, fire, and hope. The shell is supposed to explode at a specific altitude, creating the cloud of shrapnel the aircraft will fly through. Most of the time, it doesn't work. The aircraft changes speed. The gunner's calculations are wrong. The fuse timing is imprecise. The shell explodes harmlessly thousands of feet from its target or impacts the ground without detonating anywhere near an enemy plane. At Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American anti-aircraft guns fire thousands of timed fuse shells at Japanese aircraft. 48 civilians die that morning in Honolulu. Most are killed not by Japanese bombs, but by improperly fused American anti-aircraft shells that explode on impact with the ground instead of in the air near enemy aircraft. The shells that do explode at altitude rarely hit anything. In the worst cases during the early war period, American gunners fire thousands of shells for every single enemy aircraft destroyed. That isn't air defense. That's ammunition waste. The US Navy understands immediately they have a critical problem. Modern aircraft are too fast, too maneuverable, flying at altitudes that make accurate time fusing nearly impossible. What gunners need is a fuse that will automatically detonate when a shell comes close to an enemy aircraft. A proximity fuse. The concept isn't new. Multiple nations have explored the idea for years. Every attempt has failed because the engineering challenges seem insurmountable. To work effectively, a proximity fuse needs to sense when it's near a target and detonate automatically. That means incorporating some kind of electronic sensor into the nose of an artillery shell. But artillery shells experience forces that destroy conventional electronics instantly. When fired from a 5-inch naval gun, a shell accelerates to 2,800 feet per second in the length of the gun barrel. That creates a setback force of 20,000 times the force of gravity, 20,000 G-forces. Simultaneously, the rifling grooves in the gun barrel spin the shell at 25,000 revolutions per minute to stabilize its flight. Any electronic components inside the shell are subjected to crushing acceleration, violent rotation, and impact forces that pulverize ordinary vacuum tubes into glass powder and metal fragments. Then there are the practical requirements. The fuse needs to be small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell. It needs to be reliable enough for mass production. It needs safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation that could kill friendly gun crews. It needs to be weatherproof, stable in storage for months, and cheap enough to manufacture by the millions. It needs to work in rain, fog, at night, in tropical heat and Arctic cold, and it needs to be simple enough that ordinary sailors can handle it safely without specialized training. German scientists have been working on proximity fuses since the early 1930s. By 1944, they've explored more than 30 different designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sounds, electrostatic field detection, and radio frequency systems. None work reliably. In 1943, German engineers reach a definitive conclusion. Building a vacuum tube-based radio fuse for artillery shells is technologically impossible. The acceleration forces will destroy the tubes. The problem cannot be solved. British scientists reach a different conclusion. Starting in 1939, researchers at Pi Limited begin developing ruggedized vacuum tubes that can withstand high acceleration. By 1940, they have working prototypes of proximity fuses for unrotated projectiles, which is the British cover name for solid-fueled rockets. Rockets have relatively gentle acceleration compared to artillery shells, so the electronic components face less stress. The British fuses work adequately in rockets, but attempts to adapt them for high-velocity artillery consistently fail. The tubes shatter, the circuits fail. The fuses are unreliable. In August 1940, a British technical mission led by Henry Tizard arrives in the United States, carrying a black metal deed box containing Britain's most secret military technologies. Among the items in that box are circuit diagrams and prototypes of British proximity fuse designs. The British hope American industry can solve the manufacturing problems they cannot overcome alone. The National Defense Research Committee assigns the Proximity Fuse Project to Section T of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Section T is led by Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist who helped develop the theoretical foundations for radar in the 1920s. Tuve understands that the core technical challenge is not the concept, but the execution. Radio proximity fuses are conceptually simple. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell emits radio waves. When those waves reflect off a nearby target, a receiver circuit detects the reflected signal and triggers a detonator. Simple concept, extraordinarily difficult engineering. Tuve assembles a team of physicists and engineers and gives them an impossible deadline. The Navy needs working proximity fuses for 5-inch anti-aircraft guns as soon as possible. Japanese air power is destroying American ships. Without an effective anti-aircraft defense, the Navy cannot operate in the Pacific. Tuve's team has months, not years, to solve problems that have stumped British and German scientists for a decade. The team includes some of the brightest minds in American physics and engineering. Richard Roberts and Henry Porter conduct experiments on circuit designs. Robert Broad works on receiver sensitivity. Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman from the National Bureau of Standards develop fuse designs for rockets and bombs. The collaboration brings together academic researchers, government scientists, and industrial engineers in ways that have never been attempted before. Every member understands they are racing against time. American sailors are dying in the Pacific while they work. The first breakthrough comes from Lloyd Berkner, one of Tuve's engineers. Berkner develops a system using separate transmitter and receiver circuits instead of a combined transceiver. This simplifies the electronics and makes the system more reliable. But the vacuum tube problem remains unsolved. Standard vacuum tubes shatter under the acceleration forces of gunfire. The glass envelopes crack, the filaments break, the tube elements come loose and destroy the circuits. The solution comes from Western Electric Company and Raytheon. These companies manufacture miniature vacuum tubes for hearing aids. Hearing aid tubes are already ruggedized for portable use. They're small, mechanically robust, and use relatively little power. Working with Tuve's specifications, Western Electric and Raytheon engineers modify hearing aid tube designs to survive artillery gun firing. They reinforce the glass envelopes. They redesign the filament mounts. They test the tubes by firing them from air cannons into solid blocks of wood, subjecting them to acceleration forces far exceeding what they would experience in actual combat. Most tubes fail. The engineers redesign them, test again, fail again, redesign again. By January 1942, after months of iterative testing and redesign, they have vacuum tubes that survive 20,000 G-forces and 25,000 RPM spin rates. The tubes are tiny, barely larger than a rifle cartridge. Each proximity fuse requires 5 of these miniature tubes, along with resistors, capacitors, a battery, a safety mechanism, and a detonator, all packed into a space smaller than a beer can and weighing less than 2 pounds. The battery system alone presents enormous challenges. Standard batteries cannot withstand the firing shock. Engineers develop a reserve battery that is activated by the setback force of firing. A small glass ampule containing electrolyte shatters when the shell is fired, activating the battery. The safety mechanisms require equally innovative solutions. The fuse needs to remain completely inert during handling, transportation, and loading. It cannot arm until the shell has traveled far enough from the gun to protect friendly forces. Engineers design a complex system using mercury switches that require centrifugal force from the shell's rotation to close, combined with a timer that ensures at least 0.3 of a second elapse after firing before the fuse can detonate. This means the shell has to travel at least 750 feet from the gun before it becomes active. Even if a shell misfires and falls near the gun crew, it will remain harmless. In early August 1942, the Navy conducts the first live-fire test of proximity-fused shells in Chesapeake Bay. The cruiser USS Cleveland fires at radio-controlled drone aircraft on August 12 during its shakedown cruise. The test is scheduled for 2 days. It ends after 1 day because all the drones are destroyed. The gun crews aboard Cleveland fire 4 shells. 3 drones are destroyed. Navy observers present at the test are astonished by the results. The proximity fuses work perfectly. For the first time in history, anti-aircraft gunners can reliably hit moving aerial targets without direct hits. The shells just need to pass within 70 feet of the target, and the proximity fuse will detonate automatically, shredding the target with shrapnel. The improvement over timed fused shells is so dramatic that some Navy officers initially suspect the test has been rigged or that the results are somehow misleading. But subsequent tests confirm the initial findings. The proximity fuse represents a genuine breakthrough in anti-aircraft warfare, but successful testing and combat deployment are very different things. Tuve's team needs to scale up from prototype production to mass manufacturing. By January 1943, Section T has moved from the Carnegie Institution to a much larger facility and been reorganized as the Applied Physics Laboratory under Johns Hopkins University, with Tuve as director. The project now involves 26 contractors and 10,000 workers. More than 100 American companies contribute to proximity fuse production, including General Electric, RCA, Raytheon, Sylvania, Westinghouse, Eastman Kodak, Zenith, Philco, and even Wurlitzer, the organ manufacturer. Each proximity fuse contains 130 miniaturized electronic components. Assembly requires precision work. Workers at factories across America build these fuses without knowing what they're building. Security is absolute. The project has the same classification level as the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. Workers who ask what the fuses are for are told only that they're critical to winning the war. Many workers never learn the truth until after the war ends. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, becomes one of the largest proximity fuse manufacturers, producing 5.2 million units, roughly 24% of total wartime production. The company converts its barrel organ factory into a fuse assembly line. General Electric's Christmas tree lamp factory in Cleveland is retooled to produce miniature vacuum tubes. Eastman Kodak, RCA, and Sylvania join the production effort. At peak production, American factories are manufacturing more than 100,000 proximity fuses per week. The fuses that cost $732 each in early 1942 cost just $18 each by 1945. That price reduction reflects both improved manufacturing efficiency and the economies of scale that only American industry can achieve. In November 1942, the Navy ships 5,000 proximity fuses to Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet receives 4,500 of them and begins distributing them to ships operating in the Solomon Islands. But the fuses come with strict restrictions. They can only be used over open water where dud shells will sink to the ocean floor. If a fuse fails to detonate and falls on land, Japanese engineers might recover it and reverse engineer the technology. That risk is considered unacceptable. On January 5, 1943, those restrictions are put to the test. The light cruiser USS Helena is operating off Cape Hunter on the south coast of Guadalcanal when Japanese dive bombers attack. This is where our story began. After dropping their bombs, the aircraft pull up and begin climbing away. Lieutenant Red Cochran commands Helena's aft 5-inch battery. He orders his gun crews to fire 3 salvos with proximity-fused shells at the departing aircraft. The gun crews have minimal time to aim. The aircraft is already several thousand feet away and climbing fast. All 3 shells explode in the air near the dive bomber. The aircraft disintegrates and falls into the ocean. Helena's crew has achieved the first confirmed kill of an enemy aircraft using a proximity-fused shell in combat. It isn't a lucky hit. It's repeatable technology. Over the next 12 months, the effectiveness of proximity fuses in naval combat becomes undeniable. In 1943, Navy ships fire 9,128 proximity-fused rounds and destroy 61 enemy aircraft. That's 1 kill for every 155 shells fired. The old timed fused shells required 508 rounds per kill. The proximity fuse is more than 3 times as effective. And this is just the beginning. As gun crews gain experience with the new fuses and fire control systems improve, the kill ratios get even better. By 1944, the number of proximity-fused rounds fired climbs to 32,826, accounting for hundreds of aircraft destroyed. During the Marianas Campaign, proximity-fused 5-inch shells provide critical air defense for carrier task forces operating deep in Japanese-controlled waters. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American ships equipped with proximity fuses shoot down numerous Japanese aircraft attempting to attack the carriers. The Japanese naval aviators, among the most experienced in their fleet, find themselves unable to penetrate the defensive screen created by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. One Navy study concludes that for every enemy plane destroyed, 5-inch guns had previously needed to fire approximately 1,000 timed fused shells. With proximity fuses, that number drops to about 250 shells per kill, a 4-fold improvement in effectiveness. On May 11, 1945, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley is on radar picket duty off Okinawa when more than 100 Japanese aircraft attack in a coordinated strike. Hadley's 5-inch guns are equipped with proximity fuses. In 90 minutes of continuous combat, Hadley shoots down 23 aircraft, setting an all-time US Navy record for a single engagement. Every proximity-fused shell that comes within 70 feet of a target detonates automatically, filling the sky with lethal shrapnel patterns that aircraft cannot avoid. The nearby destroyer, USS Evans, accounts for 19 additional aircraft before being forced to retire. Together, the 2 destroyers shoot down more than 40 enemy aircraft. Both ships receive Presidential Unit citations for this action. The after-action report describes the proximity fuse as indispensable. But while the Navy is using proximity fuses extensively in the Pacific, the Army is prohibited from using them over land in Europe. The restriction remains in place through 1943 and most of 1944. Army artillery officers know proximity fuses exist. They've heard reports from the Pacific. They know the technology works. But Pentagon officials fear that even a single dud shell falling into German hands could compromise Allied air superiority. Germany has the most advanced scientific establishment of any Axis power. If German engineers reverse engineer the proximity fuse, they might develop countermeasures that could blind Allied radar or create their own proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that would devastate Allied bomber formations over Germany. The risk seems too great. That calculation changes on June 12, 1944. Germany begins launching Vone cruise missiles at London. The V-1s are jet-propelled flying bombs, pilotless aircraft packed with explosives and aimed at civilian targets. They fly low and fast, approaching speeds of 400 miles per hour. They are extremely difficult to intercept. Traditional anti-aircraft guns can rarely hit them because the V-1s are too small and too fast for accurate time fusing. British fighter pilots try to shoot them down or tip their wings to send them off course, but it's dangerous work, and many pilots die attempting it. The V-1s kill tens of thousands of civilians and cause massive damage to London. The Pentagon authorizes limited use of proximity fuses to defend London against the Vone attacks on June 12, 1944. Initially, the fuses are restricted to 90mm anti-aircraft guns and British 3.7-inch guns, positioned along the English coast, where dud shells will fall into the ocean. The results are immediate and dramatic. In the first week of operations, British anti-aircraft guns destroy 17% of incoming V-1s. This is already better than the 24% success rate achieved with traditional methods, including fighter interceptions and anti-aircraft fire combined. But as gun crews gain experience with the new fuses and fire control radars improve, the success rate climbs steadily. By the end of the fourth week, proximity-fused shells are accounting for 79% of all V-1s destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. By late August, after proximity fuses are widely deployed across the entire defensive belt, that percentage reaches 74% of all incoming missiles. On some days, it reaches 82%. The Germans launched 9,300 V-1s at England between June and August. Without proximity fuses, the casualties and destruction would have been catastrophic. The proximity fuse has saved London from what could have been an even more devastating assault. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later calls the proximity fuse potent against the small unmanned aircraft and credits it with preventing far greater loss of life. When Vone attacks shift to the port of Antwerp in September 1944, the restrictions on proximity fuse use over land loosen further. Antwerp is critical for supplying Allied armies advancing into Germany. Losing the port would cripple the Allied offensive. The Germans recognize Antwerp's strategic importance and redirect their remaining Vone launchers to target the city and port facilities. Between October 1944 and March 1945, the Germans launch more than 8,000 V-1s at Antwerp. British and American anti-aircraft units establish defensive belts around the city. The British 11th Armoured Division defending Antwerp comes under a particularly intense barrage in September that requires emergency modifications to anti-aircraft fuses. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati works around the clock to produce the specialized fuses needed. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorizes a special flight of Lancaster bombers to transport the fuses from Cincinnati to Europe, demonstrating the critical importance attached to maintaining Antwerp's defenses. Once the modified proximity fuses are deployed, a single anti-aircraft unit in Antwerp destroys 48 of the first 75 V-1s they encounter, a 64% success rate. With the Vone threat largely mitigated, the port of Antwerp remains open for the duration of the war. By the end of the campaign, anti-aircraft units equipped with proximity fuses have destroyed more than 2,000 V-1s targeting Antwerp and London combined. On October 25, 1944, the combined Chiefs of Staff authorized general use of proximity fuses over land for anti-aircraft defense, formalizing what has become standard practice across the European theater. But ground artillery still cannot use proximity fuses against enemy troops. Army artillery officers are furious. They know proximity fuses would be devastatingly effective against ground targets. A conventional artillery shell detonates on impact with the ground, which means that troops in trenches, foxholes, or behind cover are protected. But a shell that detonates in the air above them would spray shrapnel downward into their positions. Trenches become death traps. Foxholes offer no safety. Even log-reinforced bunkers can be penetrated by high-velocity fragments. Proximity-fused artillery would multiply the lethality of American firepower many times over. But the Pentagon holds firm. The risk of a dud shell falling into German hands is still considered too high. Army artillery will have to wait. Then, at 05:30 on December 16, 1944, Germany launches Operation Watch on the Rhine. 3 German armies attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, hitting thinly held American positions with overwhelming force. The attack achieves complete surprise. German armor punches through American lines and begins driving west toward the Meuse River and the Belgian port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge has begun, and American forces are in serious trouble. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson makes his decision within minutes of the attack beginning. His 406th Field Artillery Group has just received shipments of Posit shells, the Army code name for proximity-fused artillery rounds. When the 38th Cavalry Squadron calls for fire support, Axelson knows conventional shells will have limited effectiveness against German infantry advancing through forested terrain, but proximity-fused shells detonating above the trees will kill anything in the open. He orders his gunners to load Posit and fire. The effect is immediate and devastating. German infantry caught in the barrage are cut down by airbursts they never see coming. The attack on the 38th Cavalry Squadron collapses. 3 days later, on December 19th, General Dwight Eisenhower formally requests authorization to use proximity-fused artillery shells across the entire European theatre. The German offensive is the largest attack the US Army has ever faced. Every advantage matters. On December 21st, all restrictions are lifted. Proximity-fused artillery shells are released for general use. The timing is critical. SS Colonel Otto Skorzeni's troops are attacking the town of Malmedy. American artillery battalions supporting Malmedy fire proximity fuses with devastating effect. The attacking German soldiers find themselves caught in airbursts that detonate overhead with no warning. Some Germans charge directly into the artillery fire, hands raised, screaming, "Kamerad," the German word for comrade, trying to surrender. By December 23rd, estimates suggest as many as 2,000 German soldiers have been killed by proximity-fused artillery shells in just the first few days of their use. The Germans quickly realize they're facing a new type of weapon. Prisoners of war repeatedly describe the demoralizing effect of artillery shells that explode in the air above them with perfect timing. Traditional artillery gives soldiers a brief moment of hope. They hear the whistle of incoming shells and dive for cover. If they're in a trench or foxhole, they might survive even a direct hit nearby because the explosion is on the surface. But proximity-fused shells detonate 30 to 50 feet in the air directly above defensive positions. There is no cover. There is no warning. The shells arrive silently at high velocity and detonate overhead, raining shrapnel straight down. Soldiers who had felt safe in prepared defensive positions are being killed without ever seeing the threat. The psychological impact is severe. German commanders offer rewards for any soldier who can recover an intact proximity fuse. They need to understand how the weapon works so they can develop countermeasures or copy the technology. In late December 1944, German forces capture an American ammunition dump that contains 20,000 proximity-fused artillery shells. German engineers examine the fuses carefully. They recognize sophisticated electronics are involved, but they cannot understand how the technology works. Most critically, German engineers cannot believe that miniature vacuum tubes could survive the acceleration forces of artillery gun firing. Their own research has convinced them such tubes are impossible to manufacture. They assume the captured fuses are defective or designed for a different application. They never realize what they're looking at. By the time German scientists understand the significance of proximity fuses, the war is nearly over, and Germany has no industrial capacity left to develop countermeasures. On the night of December 25th and 26th, 1944, General George Patton's Third Army catches a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River near Echternach, Luxembourg. American artillery units fire a concentrated barrage using proximity-fused shells. The shells detonate above the river, and the German troops massed on the banks. There is no cover on the riverbank, no place to hide. The German soldiers are completely exposed in the open. Patton writes a letter to the War Department describing the result. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. 702 confirmed German dead in a single artillery barrage. That is unprecedented lethality. Conventional artillery shells might have killed 50 or 60 soldiers under similar circumstances. The proximity fuse has multiplied the effectiveness of American artillery by more than 10 times, and this is not an isolated incident. Throughout the Battle of the Bulge, proximity-fused artillery devastates German formations caught in the open. In the Hürtgen forest, an American chief ordnance officer reports finding 96 bodies from a German patrol hit by a massed proximity-fused artillery barrage. The bodies looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder, he writes in his report. The high-velocity artillery shells arrive too quickly for German soldiers to hear them coming. The air bursts detonate with no warning. Foxholes provide no protection. The shrapnel even penetrates log-reinforced bunkers that would have stopped conventional artillery. German units that try to advance through artillery fire are annihilated. German commanders report that their soldiers are refusing orders to move forward because they know proximity-fused artillery can kill them even in covered positions. Prisoners of war interviewed after capture describe being in a dazed state after surviving proximity-fused barrages. They realize they're facing a new kind of artillery but cannot understand how it works or how to evade it. Minor mutinies break out among German units that are ordered into areas known to be covered by American artillery. Some German soldiers simply refuse to leave their bunkers when proximity-fused artillery is falling. The Germans feel safe from traditional timed artillery because heavy overcast weather prevents accurate aerial observation. American forward observers cannot see German positions clearly, which means timed artillery shells would be set based on estimates that are often inaccurate. German troops have learned to take cover whenever they hear artillery fire and wait for the barrage to end. But proximity-fused shells do not require accurate observation. The fuses automatically detonate at the optimal height above ground, regardless of weather conditions or visibility. American gunners just need to know the approximate location of German forces and fire. The proximity fuses do the rest. The bad weather that had protected German forces now means nothing. By late January 1945, German resistance in the Ardennes has collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge is over. American forces have stopped the largest German offensive of the war and are preparing to cross the Rhine River into Germany. Proximity-fused artillery has played a critical role in that victory. Patton later states that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. While that is an overstatement, the proximity fuse has undeniably changed the tactical situation. German forces that would have been able to defend prepared positions effectively against conventional artillery are wiped out by airbursts they cannot avoid. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the story of the proximity fuse against the Luftwaffe begins earlier, during those months when the technology is restricted to anti-aircraft use only. When the Battle of the Bulge opens on December 16th, the German offensive includes last-ditch concentrated aerial assaults by the Luftwaffe. German pilots who have survived years of combat against American and British fighters suddenly encounter something they've never seen before. Anti-aircraft fire that seems impossibly accurate. A Luftwaffe pilot named Klaus Hartmann, flying a Focke-Wulf 190 over the Ardennes on December 18th, later describes his experience to American interrogators after his capture on April 3, 1945. We approached the American columns at 2,000 meters, standard strafing altitude. The anti-aircraft fire began immediately, but something was wrong. The shells were not exploding at fixed altitudes as they always had. They were tracking us, following our aircraft, detonating at precisely the right distance. Hartmann pulls into a diving turn, trying to evade the flak. The shells follow. 3 of his squadron mates are hit in rapid succession. Their aircraft disintegrate in midair, not from direct hits, but from shells that explode near them with perfect timing. Hartmann survives by diving to treetop level and fleeing at maximum speed, but he returns to base, shaken. His squadron commander doesn't believe his report. Anti-aircraft shells cannot track aircraft. They detonate at preset altitudes. Hartmann must have been mistaken, disoriented by combat stress. But within days, similar reports flood Luftwaffe intelligence from pilots across the entire Western Front. American anti-aircraft fire has changed. The shells are behaving in ways that seem impossible. They're detonating at precisely the right altitude to hit aircraft, regardless of evasive maneuvers, regardless of altitude changes. Pilots who have survived hundreds of missions suddenly find themselves unable to penetrate Allied air defenses. From December 16, 1944, when restrictions on proximity fuse use over land are lifted, until the Allies cross the Rhine into Germany in March 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire brings down more than 1,000 German aircraft. That's 1,000 Luftwaffe pilots and crew who encounter a weapon their scientists had declared could never be built. The reports reaching German high command are confused and contradictory. Some pilots describe shells that seem to know where the aircraft is. Others report explosions that occur at impossible distances, as if the shells can sense the aircraft from far away. Luftwaffe intelligence officers struggle to understand what they're hearing. The descriptions don't match any known anti-aircraft technology. German scientists are consulted. They review the reports and reach a conclusion that seems obvious. The pilots are mistaken. They're describing conventional proximity-fused weapons, but such weapons cannot exist in artillery form. Germany's own research program has proven this conclusively. Vacuum tubes cannot survive the acceleration forces of artillery gun firing. The technology is impossible. What the German scientists don't know, what they cannot imagine, is that American engineers have solved a problem German engineers concluded was unsolvable. The miniature ruggedized vacuum tubes developed by Western Electric and Raytheon can withstand forces that German scientists insisted would destroy any electronic component. American industry is mass-producing these tubes at a rate of millions per month. German industry cannot even prototype them successfully. The interrogation of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring by American officers on May 10, 1945, reveals the depth of German ignorance. General Karl Spaatz, commander of strategic air forces in Europe, asks Göring directly, "Have you any knowledge of a proximity fuse?" Göring responds that German scientists were working on such a device and that it would have been in production in 3 or 4 months. Spaatz's follow-up question is telling. Has Japan the designs of this fuse? Göring's reply exposes the fundamental problem. I do not think so, because it was not yet in production, and we never gave them anything unless it was in production. The Japanese have had the designs of the Mi-262 for some time. Germany shares jet fighter technology with Japan, but not proximity fuse technology, because Germany doesn't have working proximity fuse technology to share. Even in May 1945, after the war in Europe has ended, Göring believes Germany was only months away from production. He doesn't understand that Germany was years behind American development, and that even if German scientists had solved the theoretical problems, German industry lacked the capacity to manufacture the components at the scale required for military effectiveness. Air Force General Sam Phillips expresses the Allied perspective in a 1988 interview. Had the Germans perfected an effective proximity fuse well before the war ended, the outcome of the war could significantly have been affected. If the Luftwaffe had possessed proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, the Allied bombing campaign over Germany would have been far more costly or stopped altogether. But the Germans never perfected it. More than 30 different proximity-fuse designs were researched in Germany, some based on acoustic sensors triggered by engine noise, some using electrostatic field detection, some attempting radio frequency systems similar to what the Allies developed. None reached production. None worked reliably enough for combat use. German engineers concluded the problem was unsolvable with existing technology. In stark terms of economy, the Germans calculated that downing a single Allied aircraft required approximately 4,000 rounds of traditional flak at a cost of 100 marks per round. That's 400,000 marks to destroy one bomber. Without proximity fuses, German anti-aircraft artillery had to rely on preset detonation altitudes and dense patterns of fire, hoping that sheer volume would compensate for inaccuracy. American proximity fuses changed that calculus completely. Ships equipped with 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused ammunition could create a lethal zone extending thousands of yards from the ship. Any aircraft entering that zone faced a statistical probability of destruction that approached certainty. The same principle applied to land-based anti-aircraft batteries. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves flying into invisible spheres of death, where shells would detonate automatically at precisely the right distance to ensure a kill. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was severe. They'd spent years developing tactics to evade conventional anti-aircraft fire. They knew how to read flak patterns, how to time their approaches, how to exploit gaps in defensive fire. Proximity-fused shells made all those tactics irrelevant. The shells didn't need to be aimed with perfect accuracy. They just needed to pass within 70 feet of an aircraft, and they would detonate automatically. Luftwaffe pilots reported feeling helpless against weapons that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers. There was no way to evade this defense. Traditional anti-aircraft shells had a predictable detonation pattern. Pilots could watch the flak bursts, estimate the altitude settings, and fly above or below the defensive fire. Proximity-fused shells eliminated that option. They detonated at whatever altitude the aircraft was flying. Some historians have suggested that the introduction of proximity fuses was one factor that pushed Germany toward more desperate tactics in the final months of the war. If conventional attack methods couldn't penetrate Allied defenses, perhaps suicide attacks or guided weapons were the only option. The Von and V2 programs received massive resource allocation, in part because manned aircraft were becoming suicidally dangerous to operate against Allied air defenses. The proximity fuse demonstrated a pattern that would repeat throughout World War II and beyond. Technological advantage in warfare doesn't come primarily from theoretical breakthroughs. It comes from engineering, execution, and manufacturing scale. The concept of a proximity fuse was well understood by multiple nations before the war began. Germany, Britain, Japan, and the United States all knew what they wanted to build. What separated success from failure was the ability to solve thousands of small engineering problems, manufacture components to precise tolerances, and produce complex electronic devices in quantities of millions while maintaining quality control. The United States had the industrial base, the skilled workforce, and the organizational structure that could coordinate work across dozens of contractors. Germany and Japan did not. By 1944, American industry was producing more proximity fuses every month than Germany and Japan had produced artillery shells of all types combined. General George Patton had been correct when he wrote that armies would need to devise new methods of warfare once proximity-fused artillery became widespread. The assumption that soldiers in trenches or foxholes were safe from artillery fire had been fundamental to military tactics since World War I. The proximity fuse shattered that assumption. Defensive positions that had been considered adequate protection against artillery were now death traps. Armies would need to disperse more widely, dig deeper fortifications, and move faster to avoid artillery barrages. The tactical changes forced by proximity-fused artillery rippled through military doctrine for decades. Section T operated on an accelerated timeline that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. From the initial assignment in August 1940 to the first combat use in January 1943 was less than 2.5 years. During that time, Tuve's team had solved problems that had stumped scientists in multiple countries for more than a decade. They'd developed miniature, ruggedized vacuum tubes that could survive forces no civilian electronics had ever faced. They'd first designed circuits that operated reliably under conditions of extreme vibration, temperature variation, and electromagnetic interference. They'd created manufacturing processes that could produce complex electronic devices at scales previously thought impossible. And they'd done all of this while maintaining absolute secrecy that prevented enemy intelligence from learning what they were building. Dr. Merle Tuve never received public recognition for leading the development of the proximity fuse during the war. The project remained classified until after Japan surrendered. Even after the war ended, Tuve was reluctant to discuss his role. He understood that Section T had solved an engineering problem that saved thousands of Allied lives. But he also knew that many people at many organizations had contributed to that success. The proximity fuse was not the work of a single genius. It was the product of systematic collaboration between physicists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel across dozens of organizations. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during World War II by more than 100 manufacturers. That scale of production required contributions from thousands of people, most of whom never knew what they were building. After the war, Tuve returned to the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution and served as its director from 1946 to 1966. He continued research in geophysics and radio astronomy. In 1948, he was named an honorary commander of the Order of the British Empire for his service to the Allied cause during the war. President Harry Truman awarded him the Presidential Medal for Merit, but Tuve rarely spoke about the proximity fuse. When asked about his wartime work, he emphasized the collaborative nature of the project and the contributions of the engineers and technicians who had solved countless technical problems that made mass production possible. Dr. Merle Tuve died on May 20, 1982, at the age of 80. His obituaries mentioned his contributions to geophysics and his leadership of the Applied Physics Laboratory during World War II, but most did not detail the specific work he had done on proximity fuses. The technology had been declassified for decades, but it remained obscure outside military and technical circles. Tuve himself had never sought publicity for his wartime work. He believed that scientific achievement should be measured by results, not recognition. The proximity fuse had saved lives and helped win the war. That was what mattered. The Applied Physics Laboratory that Tuve founded continues to operate today as a research facility of Johns Hopkins University. It conducts work in national security, space exploration, and advanced technology development. The building in Silver Spring, Maryland, where Section T first assembled proximity fuses in 1942, no longer stands. It was demolished decades ago and replaced by commercial development. There is no memorial marker at the site. Nothing identifies it as the place where one of the war's most important technologies was born. The workers who assembled proximity fuses in factories across America went back to their peacetime jobs when the war ended. Most never learned exactly what they'd been building. The soldiers and sailors who benefited from proximity-fused ammunition rarely knew the technical details of how the fuses worked. They just knew that anti-aircraft guns were suddenly much more effective and artillery barrages were far more lethal. The technology remained mysterious even to the people whose lives it saved. The 702 German soldiers killed by proximity-fused artillery on the banks of the Sauer River in December 1944 were buried in military cemeteries in Luxembourg and Germany. Their graves do not mention how they died. The military records list them as killed in action by artillery fire, which was true but incomplete. They were among the first ground troops anywhere to be killed by a technology that their own scientists had declared impossible. They died not knowing that the shells exploding above them contained miniature radar sets more sophisticated than anything Germany had been able to build. They died not knowing that American factories were producing these shells by the hundreds of thousands, while German industry struggled to manufacture basic artillery ammunition. The German engineers who had declared proximity fuses impossible never understood what they had missed. After the war, American technical intelligence teams interrogated German scientists and showed them captured German documents detailing their proximity fuse research. The Germans had explored most of the same technical approaches that Section T had used. They'd considered radio frequency fuses, vacuum tube designs, and miniaturization techniques. But they'd concluded that the engineering challenges couldn't be overcome with existing technology. What separated the American project from the German project was not a difference in scientific knowledge, but a difference in engineering persistence and manufacturing capability. American industry could produce miniature, ruggedized vacuum tubes in quantities of millions. American engineers could iterate through dozens of design failures until they found solutions that worked. Germany lacked the industrial base and the time to compete on those terms. British scientists who had contributed the initial circuit designs to Section T watched the American success with mixed feelings. They'd solved many of the conceptual problems, but had been unable to scale up to mass production. The British proximity fuse program produced working prototypes but never achieved the reliability and cost-effectiveness needed for large-scale military deployment. When the Tizard mission delivered British proximity fuse designs to Section T in August 1940, they gave the Americans a starting point. But as Tuve later noted, the circuit design that Section T made work was substantially different from the British design. American engineers had redesigned nearly every aspect of the fuse to meet Navy specifications and survive the brutal forces of artillery gun firing. This is how wars are actually won. Not through dramatic breakthroughs or genius inventors working in isolation, but through systematic collaboration between scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel. The proximity fuse succeeded because Section T could draw on the resources of American industry, the technical expertise of academic researchers, and the practical knowledge of Navy ordnance officers who understood what combat conditions would demand. It succeeded because Western Electric and Raytheon could manufacture ruggedized vacuum tubes that no one had built before. It succeeded because factory workers across America could assemble complex electronics at scales that would have been impossible for any other nation. And it succeeded because Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson made the decision to use the technology when it mattered most, even though he was violating direct orders by doing so. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of American industrial and scientific power at its peak. It is the story of what becomes possible when brilliant people are given clear objectives, adequate resources, and freedom from bureaucratic constraints. It is the story of innovation that happens not through individual genius, but through systematic problem-solving at scale. And it is the story of a technology that saved thousands of Allied lives and changed warfare forever, developed by people whose names are mostly forgotten today. The Luftwaffe pilots who encountered proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire in the final months of the war faced a weapon their scientists had assured them could never exist. They died in cockpits torn apart by shrapnel from shells that detonated with impossible precision. They died not knowing that American engineers had solved problems German engineers had declared unsolvable. They died not knowing that the impossible had become routine, manufactured by the millions, deployed across every theatre of war. In the end, the proximity fuse represented something more profound than just another weapon. It represented the difference between theoretical possibility and practical reality, between knowing what needs to be done and having the ability to do it, between scientific understanding and industrial execution. The Germans understood the theory. The British developed the concept. But only America had the combination of scientific talent, engineering skill, industrial capacity, and organizational coordination to turn theory into reality at the scale required to change the course of history. When Luftwaffe pilots encountered that reality over the skies of Europe in the winter of 1944 and 1945, they faced the consequences of their nation's industrial limitations. They flew aircraft powered by engines running on synthetic fuel because Germany lacked access to oil. They fought with ammunition rationed because factories were being bombed daily. And when they encountered American anti-aircraft fire, they died at rates that made aerial operations unsustainable, killed by technology their scientists had declared impossible to build. The proximity fuse didn't win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it saved thousands of Allied lives, multiplied the effectiveness of American firepower, and demonstrated technological and industrial superiority that demoralized enemy forces who realized they were fighting an opponent with resources they couldn't match and capabilities they couldn't counter. The next time you hear about some technological breakthrough declared impossible by experts, remember the proximity fuse. Remember Dr. Merle Tuve and his team at Section T. Remember the factory workers who built millions of miniature vacuum tubes without knowing what they were for. Remember the engineers who tested design after design until they found one that worked. Remember that impossible is often just the gap between theory and execution, and that gap can be closed by determination, resources, and systematic effort. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.